My wife said I want us to be equal, then turned our marriage into a feminist chore chart, so I followed every rule and her system fell apart on her. The moment I walked through the door, after 3 weeks away, my wife, Olivia, handed me a 3-page document. I didn't know it then, but it was the blueprint for how she was going to dismantle our marriage, piece by piece. The air in our Seattle apartment felt strangely heavy, charged with an unspoken tension that hit me before I even shed my travel jacket. Her eyes, usually warm, held a determined, almost clinical, glint. I'd been on a work trip, the longest Ethan and I had been apart since our wedding 2 years ago. I was expecting a hug, maybe some takeout on the couch, definitely not a full-blown ideological manifesto titled Restructuring Our Marriage, a Framework for Equality in Bold Times, New Roman. She didn't even let me put my suitcase down before she started talking about patriarchal patterns and emotional labor distribution. Words that sounded like they came straight from a college textbook, not from the woman who used to laugh at my dumb jokes and steal fries off my plate. Something had fundamentally changed while I was gone. Something big. As I stood there in our hallway with my jacket still on, I realized the marriage I left 3 weeks ago might not be the one I just came back to. Olivia told me to sit down at the kitchen table, her voice steady and rehearsed like she'd practiced the speech a dozen times in the mirror. I noticed her laptop was already open, displaying what looked like spreadsheets and color-coded charts. She had always been organized, sure, but this was different. This was systematic, clinical, like she was presenting a business proposal instead of talking to her husband. She explained that during my absence, she'd attended a feminist workshop a coworker had recommended, an intensive weekend seminar that apparently completely rewired how she viewed our relationship. According to her, our entire marriage had been built on invisible labor that I never acknowledged, privileges I never questioned, and traditional gender roles that she was no longer willing to accept. The document in my hands was divided into 3 main sections, each one more detailed than the last. I could tell she'd spent hours putting this together. Section 1, labeled Emotional Labor Redistribution, outlined how I was now responsible for remembering birthdays, planning social events, managing our calendar, sending thank you cards, checking in with family members, basically everything she claimed she'd been doing alone for 2 years. Section 2 covered household management equity, with a point-based system for chores where everything from vacuuming to grocery shopping had an assigned value. We were supposed to split these points 50-50 every single week. Section 3 was the wildest one, something she called deconstructing masculine defaults, which included guidelines on how I should communicate my feelings, rules about mansplaining and taking up space, and even suggestions for how I should sit during conversations to appear less domineering. I'm not going to lie, my first instinct was to laugh because this felt like something out of a satirical online post, but she wasn't smiling. She was waiting for my response with an intense expectation in her eyes. She told me she knew this would be difficult for me to hear, that men usually react defensively when confronted with their privilege, and that she was prepared for me to argue or dismiss her concerns. Here's the thing, though. I didn't argue. I didn't dismiss anything. Instead, I looked at her calmly and said something she absolutely wasn't expecting. I told her she was right, that if she felt this way, then clearly I'd been missing something important, and that I was willing to implement her system exactly as she designed it. You should have seen her face. It went from defensive to shocked to almost giddy in about 5 seconds flat, like she'd just won an argument she thought she was going to lose. She actually hugged me, told me she was proud of me for being open-minded, said this was going to make our marriage so much stronger and more equitable. What she didn't know, what I was already realizing as I flipped through her carefully formatted pages, was that I was about to give her exactly what she asked for, nothing more and nothing less. You see, Olivia had created a system based on ideology, on theories she'd absorbed during one weekend workshop, but she hadn't really thought through the practical implications of absolute equality. She wanted fairness measured and documented. She wanted every contribution tallied and balanced. She wanted the emotional comfort of knowing everything was perfectly equal. So, that's exactly what I was going to give her. That night, she was so energized, talking about how revolutionary this was going to be, how we were going to be an example for other couples, how this was the evolved version of marriage that more people needed to embrace. I nodded along, asked clarifying questions about her point system, made sure I understood every single rule she'd established. She went to bed happy, probably happier than she'd been in months, convinced that she'd finally broken through to me and that our relationship was about to enter some enlightened new phase. I stayed up late that night reading through her document multiple times, highlighting sections, making notes in the margins, treating it like the legal contract she'd essentially turned it into. The next morning was when things started to get interesting, and when my actual plan began to take shape. According to the schedule she'd created, Monday morning coffee preparation was her responsibility, alternating weeks as part of the household equity system. I woke up at my usual time, got dressed, and waited in the kitchen, but no coffee appeared because she was still asleep. Normally, I would have just made it myself, made enough for both of us, actually. But that wasn't how her system worked. Her system required that each person handle their assigned tasks without interference, without someone else stepping in to smooth things over. So, I waited, checked my phone, scrolled through emails, and when she finally came downstairs 20 minutes later, looking confused about why there was no coffee, I simply reminded her what day it was. She seemed annoyed at first, muttered something about how she'd overslept, and I could have just handled it this once, but I stayed calm and pointed to the exact page in her document where it specified Monday responsibilities. She made the coffee, made it badly actually because she was rushing and frustrated, and I could see this tiny crack forming in her certainty. This was just day one, hour one really, and already the gap between theoretical equality and practical reality was starting to show. Throughout that week, I followed every single rule she'd established with absolute precision. Never deviating, never making exceptions, never picking up slack that wasn't explicitly assigned to me. When she forgot to schedule a dinner party with her parents and then got upset that I hadn't reminded her, I pulled up the emotional labor section that clearly stated social planning with her family was her domain. When the kitchen trash overflowed on a Wednesday night, and she gave me a look, expecting me to take it out, I checked the chore chart and showed her it was marked as her responsibility until Thursday morning. Every time she got irritated or tried to suggest I was being petty, I'd simply reference her own framework, using her own language about equity and equal distribution of labor. What made this approach so effective wasn't that I was being mean or vindictive. It was that I was being perfectly, exactly, mathematically fair in the way she defined fairness. She built a system that looked great on paper, that probably sounded empowering and progressive when discussed in her workshop, but she built it without really considering what it would feel like to live inside it. By the end of that first week, I could see her starting to question things, starting to feel the weight of the structure she created, starting to realize that maybe relationships weren't meant to be managed like corporate projects. I wasn't trying to punish her or prove her wrong, exactly. I was trying to show her something much more important, that real partnership isn't about splitting everything down the middle with mathematical precision. It's about two people working together with their different strengths and accepting that equality doesn't always mean identical. She wanted a system, so I gave her a system. And now we were both going to live inside it until she understood why systems like this don't actually work in real marriages between real people who are supposed to love each other. 2 weeks into living under her equality framework, and Olivia decided the system needed an upgrade because apparently the 3-page document wasn't comprehensive enough to cover every aspect of how a properly deconstructed marriage should function. She'd been reading more articles, watching more videos, participating in online forums with other women who were on similar journeys of matrimonial revolution, and she came to me one evening with what she called communication protocols. These new rules were supposed to govern how we discussed disagreements, how I expressed opinions, and most importantly, how I processed my emotions in ways that weren't rooted in what she kept calling toxic masculinity. Anytime I tried to explain my perspective using logic or reasoning, she had a label ready for it. Told me I was engaging in logical deflection or defensive rationalization, or my personal favorite, masculine resistance. It didn't matter what I actually said, didn't matter if my points were valid or my concerns were legitimate, because she'd learned this neat trick where she could dismiss anything I said by categorizing it as a symptom of my problematic conditioning. I didn't fight back, didn't argue about the unfairness of a system where her feelings were valid exploration but my thoughts were toxic patterns. I just listened carefully and made mental notes of every single standard she was establishing. She was so focused on building her perfect ideological framework that she couldn't see what I was seeing, that every rule she created for me could be applied right back to her. That every standard she set was a standard she'd eventually have to meet herself. So, I started building my own document. Spent a few nights after she went to bed putting together what I called the reciprocal expectations framework. Typed it up in the same format she'd used. Even matched her font choices and header styles to show I was taking this just as seriously as she had. My framework had 3 sections too because symmetry matters in equality, and the first one was about financial contributions and transparency. I created a shared spreadsheet where every dollar either of us earned or spent got logged with categories and justifications, because if we were going to measure and balance household labor points, we should probably also measure and balance economic contributions. She made more money than me, not by a huge amount, but enough that it was noticeable. And under this system, that meant she was contributing more financial labor that needed to be acknowledged and potentially offset by additional household labor on my part. Or alternatively, I was contributing more household labor that should be valued at market rates and credited against the income disparity. The second section was about technical and mechanical responsibilities. All those tasks that traditionally fell to men not because of patriarchy but because of skill sets and interests, things like changing oil, handling home repairs, managing our internet and technology setup, dealing with anything that required tools or technical knowledge. Under the equity system, these were now her responsibilities on alternating weeks, and she'd need to learn how to handle them without my help, because that's what equality meant: equal capability and equal burden. The third section was the one I knew would bother her most, and I called it emotional accountability. A direct mirror of her emotional labor section, but focused on manipulation tactics, guilt-tripping, passive aggression, and wielding emotional responses as weapons in disagreements. Every time she cried during an argument to shut down the conversation. Every time she gave me the silent treatment instead of communicating directly. Every time she made me feel guilty for having boundaries. All of that was now going to be documented and addressed as her emotional labor problems that needed deconstructing. I presented this framework to her on a Saturday morning, the same way she presented hers to me, and I watched her face go through this fascinating journey of emotions as she read through it. She started out nodding like she appreciated that I was engaging with her system, then got confused when she realized my system was holding her to the same standards, then got defensive when she understood that I was completely serious about implementing all of this. She tried to argue that it wasn't the same thing, that my framework was missing the point of hers, that I was being deliberately obtuse about the purpose of examining gender roles. But I just calmly reminded her that she'd wanted measurable equality, and I was simply measuring everything. Now, from that day forward, I stopped doing any of the small, invisible things I'd always done without thinking. Stopped being the person who smoothed over rough edges and made life easier in ways she never noticed. She needed her phone charger from the bedroom while we were watching TV. Normally, I would have just grabbed it during a commercial, but I stayed on the couch because retrieving her personal items wasn't on my task list for that day. She mentioned she needed to pick up her dry cleaning before the place closed. I acknowledged the information but didn't offer to do it for her or remind her again because managing her schedule was her responsibility now. She had plans to meet her sister for lunch on Thursday but forgot to get cash from the ATM beforehand. Called me asking if I could pull money and meet her. I checked the framework and told her financial preparation for her personal social events wasn't something I was responsible for managing. Every single time she expected me to just handle something, to read her mind, to anticipate her needs, I referred back to the system and showed her exactly why that wasn't my role anymore. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon when our washing machine started making this horrible grinding noise mid-cycle and then just stopped working entirely. Died right there with a full load of wet clothes inside. According to both her original framework and my reciprocal one, mechanical failures and appliance issues fell under technical responsibilities, which meant this was her problem to solve. She called me at work expecting me to leave early and fix it, or at least deal with getting a repairman scheduled, and I could hear the panic in her voice because we had a mountain of laundry and no way to wash it. I reminded her gently that this was specifically listed under her task categories, that I had faith in her ability to handle it, that this was what equal partnership looked like. She ended up having to Google how washing machines work, watched YouTube videos trying to diagnose the problem, eventually gave up and called a repair service that couldn't come out until the following week. That evening, I watched her load 4 huge bags of dirty laundry into her car to drive to the laundromat 6 blocks away, a place neither of us had been to since we moved into our apartment because we had our own machine. She was gone for almost 3 hours. Came back exhausted and frustrated. Told me the machines ate 2 of her quarters without running, that some guy had taken her clothes out of the dryer before they were finished, that the whole place smelled like mildew and broken dreams. She looked completely defeated sitting at our kitchen table with her bags of barely dry laundry. And I could see something shifting behind her eyes. Some recognition that maybe the theoretical equality she'd read about in articles didn't account for the reality that people have different strengths and different tolerances for different types of problems. I didn't gloat, didn't say I told you so, just helped her fold the clothes because that wasn't technically violating any system rules. And because I'm not actually trying to watch my wife suffer. I'm trying to teach her something important. She was quieter than usual that night. Didn't try to enforce any of her communication protocols. Didn't label my behaviors or correct my emotional expressions. Just sat there processing what it felt like to be completely responsible for something she had no idea how to handle. The washing machine situation wasn't even the biggest issue. It was just the most obvious example of a pattern that was playing out across every area of our lives now, where her ideology was crashing hard against practical reality and losing every single time. The morning after the laundromat disaster, I woke up to find Olivia sitting at the kitchen table with both our frameworks printed out in front of her. All those pages of rules and categories and point systems that we'd been living under for the past month. And she had this look on her face that I hadn't seen since before any of this started. She told me she couldn't do it anymore, said the words quietly like she was admitting defeat in a war she'd started. And I could see her hands shaking slightly as she pushed the papers away from her. What came next was the most honest conversation we'd had in months, maybe longer, because she finally stopped hiding behind academic language and workshop terminology and just talked to me like a real person. She explained that she'd been feeling invisible in our marriage for a while before I left on that trip. Felt like everything she did went unnoticed and unappreciated. Felt like she was managing our entire life while I just existed inside it without seeing the structure she'd built. The workshop hadn't given her these feelings. It had just given her a vocabulary for them, a framework that made her feel like her frustrations were valid and political rather than just personal and scary. She thought if she could turn our relationship into a system with clear rules and measurements, then maybe she'd finally feel seen, finally have proof that her contributions mattered, finally get the recognition she'd been craving. But the system didn't make her feel seen. It made her feel even more alone because now we were just 2 people following instructions instead of 2 people loving each other. She started crying. Not the manipulative crying from arguments, but real genuine tears, and she admitted that she'd become exactly what she accused me of being, authoritative and rigid and unable to see past her own perspective. She said the workshop had sold her this idea that relationships could be perfected through proper structure, that equality was something you could achieve through documentation and distribution. But living inside that ideology had sucked all the actual humanity out of our marriage. Every interaction had become a transaction. Every gesture had to be evaluated for fairness. Every moment of spontaneous kindness was now suspect because it might throw off the balance we were supposed to maintain. She told me she'd been miserable for weeks, but couldn't admit it because admitting it meant admitting she'd been wrong, and she'd invested so much into being right about this, into proving that her new framework was enlightened and evolved. The worst part, she said, was realizing that I'd been showing her this the whole time. That every frustrating moment where I stuck to her rules exactly was me holding up a mirror to show her what she'd created. I let her talk until she ran out of words. Didn't interrupt or argue or try to fix anything. Just listened the way I should have been listening before she felt the need to build a whole ideological system around getting my attention. When she finished, I told her something I should have told her months ago. That I did notice everything she did, that I was grateful for it even when I didn't say so, that I'd taken for granted how much invisible work went into making our life comfortable. I also told her that her workshop had been half right, that emotional labor and household management were real things worth discussing, but the solution wasn't to turn our marriage into a corporate equity initiative with metrics and performance reviews. We sat there for a while just existing in the honesty of that moment. And then she did something that felt more significant than anything in the past month. She picked up all those framework documents, all those carefully formatted pages of rules and expectations, and she walked them over to the trash can and dropped them in. She didn't ask my permission, didn't check if I agreed, just made the decision that we were done living like that and acted on it. I got up and added my reciprocal framework to the trash, too. And we both just stood there looking at weeks of ideology, sitting in our garbage can where it belonged. She asked me what we were supposed to do now, how we were supposed to fix things without a system to follow. And I told her we'd figure it out the way normal people do, by talking when something bothers us and trusting each other enough to actually listen. She wanted to know how we'd make sure things stayed fair without measuring everything. And I explained that fairness in a marriage isn't about identical contributions. It's about both people feeling supported and valued for what they bring. She brings organization and social awareness and attention to detail. I bring technical skills and emotional stability and a different kind of problem solving. And neither of those things can be properly measured in points or percentages. Real partnership means accepting that sometimes one person carries more weight for a while and sometimes the other person does. And it all balances out over time without needing spreadsheets to prove it. The next day, our washing machine repair guy finally showed up. Some older dude who had the whole thing fixed in 20 minutes. And after he left, Olivia asked if I wanted to help her figure out how the machine actually worked so she'd know for next time. We ended up spending an hour looking at the manual together, her asking questions, and me explaining what I knew. And it felt like the first genuinely cooperative thing we'd done in a month. It wasn't about her learning because the system said she had to. It was about both of us building shared knowledge because that's what teams do. That evening, she made dinner without checking whose responsibility it was, and I cleaned up afterward without calculating if I'd earned enough points. And it felt shockingly normal in the best possible way. We've been rebuilding slowly since then, learning how to appreciate each other without needing external validation or ideological justification. She's gotten better at telling me directly when she feels unappreciated instead of letting it build into resentment. And I've gotten better at actually expressing gratitude for things I used to just assume were happening automatically. Neither of us wants to go back to the way things were before, but we definitely don't want the framework version either. We're trying to find something in between where we're both conscious of our partnership without being slaves to some artificial system. The workshop materials are still in her email somewhere. And sometimes she gets ads for similar programs, but she deletes them now without even reading them because she learned the hard way that other people's theories about relationships don't mean much when you're actually living inside one. We're not perfect, still figuring things out, still having disagreements about who does what and when, but at least now we're having them as partners instead of as opposing parties in some ideological experiment. And honestly, that's the only equality that ever really mattered. What do you think about how we handled it in the end?